Bez Hashem. Today's daf is daf Chaf Pei Gimel, and we will begin on daf Pei Beis on the Beis, about 5 lines from the bottom. We learned an opinion of a Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah that if a person says Harei at mutaris l'chol adam chutz except so and so, it's a good get. That's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachamim say no. How could it be a good get? You have to say Harei at mutaris l'chol adam. Period. You can't make an exception that she can't marry so and so. So, Baya asked the question. Amallah, if a man says to his wife, you're permitted to marry everybody, chutz Reuven and Shimon, except Reuven and Shimon. So right away you can see, according to Rabbi Eliezer, this is a good valid get. According to Chachamim, it's not a valid get because you're giving an exception over here. And then he tells to her, Reuven and Shimon. Then he says to her, oh, by the way, Reuven and Shimon. Now, what did he mean by that statement, Mahu? Did he now say, very simple. He asked her to marry Reuven. Now he changed his mind and says, now you can marry Reuven and Shimon. I changed my mind. So therefore, she's permitted to marry Reuven and Shimon. She's permitted to marry Reuven and Shimon. And therefore, even according to the Chachamim, it would be a good get. Maybe, my da'asa shar, my da'shara asa. Or would you say just the opposite? Now, that what he's trying to do is turn around everything that he said. He said, Reuven and Shimon, you're not permitted to marry. Now he's trying to say, Reuven and Shimon, you are permitted to marry. And maybe he's also trying to say, I allowed you to marry everybody. You can't marry everybody. So it will, again, only be a valid get according to Rabbi Eliezer, not according to Eliezer, and not according to Chachamim. So that was the question of Abaye. Intim Sulaimi, if you want to say, we go to the top of Pei Gimel Lamrav, Manda also Share, whatever he asked, he permitted. In other words, he said, then he said, except Reuven and Shimon, and then he said, Reuven and Shimon. He said, what he's trying to say is, Reuven and Shimon, you are permitted to marry them. So therefore, it would be a valid get, even according to the Chachamim. What happens if he said, Reuven Mahu, if he said that Reuven, you're allowed to marry Reuven. Did he mean that you can marry Reuven and also Shimon? Again, so it's a valid get even according to Chachamim. So why did you just say you could only marry Reuven? Because he mentioned that was the opening statement, but he meant etc. etc. You can marry Reuven and Shimon. Or Dilma, maybe he meant Reuven Dafka. Maybe he meant you could only marry Reuven and nobody else, and not Shimon. Shimon remains aser, and if Shimon remains aser, it's not a good get according to Chachamim. If you want to say Reuven Dafka Shimon Mahom. The Reuven Dafke, he meant to only matter her to Reuven and not to Shimon. So this was a get only according to Rabbi Eliezer, not according to Chachamim. What happens if he said Shimon? He said you're mutter to marry anybody you want. Then he said except Reuven and Shimon. So it's not a good get according to Chachamim. But then he said Shimon, you're allowed to marry Shimon. Maho. What did he mean? You're allowed to marry Shimon. Did he mean that you're allowed to marry Shimon and also Reuven? Why did you just mention Shimon? You're allowed to marry because that was the last word that came out of his mouth. He said you're asked to marry Reuven and Shimon, so you wanted to matter it and said Shimon. You can marry Shimon, but he meant also you can marry Reuven, so therefore it's a good get even according to Chachamim. Or maybe Shimon Dafka. Maybe he meant only you can marry Shimon and not. You can marry only Shimon and not Reuven, so it remains aser. According, this is not a good get according to Chachamim. But Rav Ashi asked another question. Afle Shimon Mahu, when he said, Harayat Materis L'Chol Adam, Chutz, he said Harayat Materis L'Chol Adam, Chutz Reuven Shimon, and then he said also Shimon. What do you mean? If you want to say that when you say Lish Shimon just without the word Af, also Shimon. So then you mean only Shimon. So the question is, what about over here? Since you said the word Af, certainly you wanted to say that also him. That means Af, Reuven, and also Shimon are mutar. And the reason why you didn't mention his name because obviously because it's understood. So that's what he means. Af l'shemahu af aruven koi is Af also saying the word Af means also Reuven and also Shimon, and therefore it's a good get according to Chachamim. What he's basically trying to say is Harayat Materis L'Chol Adam, and I said Chutz mi Reuven Shimon. No, also Shimon you could be mutter too, but not Reuven. So it's not a good get even according to Chachamim. All these questions remain unresolved. Tana Rabbana, the rabbis taught again. Rabbi Eliezer has this opinion in the Mishnah, and we could go back to the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says that if a person says Harayat Mutaris L'Chol Adam El L'Ploini, except Pliny. Either this Ella means except Pliny, or on condition you don't marry Pliny, on the condition you don't marry so and so. Rabbi Eliezer says it's permitted. That's a good get. The Chachamim says it's not a good get. So now the Gemara, this opinion to leave somebody out that she cannot marry in a get was Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, and all the other Tanoim disagreed with him, and they had big problems with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Tanrabanim, we learned to the Brisa. After the passing of Rabbi Eliezer, 4 elders came and had problems with what Rabbi Eliezer said. These are the 4 elders: Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Tafel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. They all had a problem with Rabbi Eliezer. Now, Rabbi Tarfon said like this. He spoke loudly. The na'ana means when you speak loudly, you use the word na'ana. Well, anu shira. So now Rabbi Tarfon said like this. How could it be that if you leave somebody out, it will still be that you can't marry, it would still be a good get? Let's say she married the brother of the person she was not supposed to marry. Suppose she was not supposed to marry Reuven, and she married Shimon, the brother of Reuven, and Shimon died, and now all of a sudden she's supposed to fall to Reuven, who she's not supposed to marry. If Shimon died without children, she falls to Reuven. Isn't this going to cause something that she cannot do the mitzvah of Yibam, that Reuven cannot do the mitzvah of Yibam? Because if he does the mitzvah of Yibam, turns out she wasn't had a get from the first guy. So this is Halamada. This should teach you this is not a good way. Shouldn't be a good get. A get that leaves somebody out that she cannot marry is not a good get. That was Rab Tarfon's refutation against Rabbi Eliezer. Now Rabbi Eliezer Glili had a problem with Rab Tarfon. How could you have a get that allows her to marry 99% of people, and 1 person she can't? Hey, where do you find in something that's also that should be also to one person and permitted to another person? Usually the Torah, like not eating chazer, nobody can eat chazer, and eating kosher food is permitted for everybody. Or also the call. If something's also, it's also to everybody. If something's mutter, it's mutter for everybody. Should teach you that is not a good way to make a get. Nana Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, creases, the Torah says you have to sever. When a man gets married to a woman, the man caused that she's now is usher on the entire world. She's prohibited to marry anybody. She's designated for one person. When he gives her a divorce, and she still remains also to one person, so she's not completely severed from the original man. And the Torah says a get means severance, that she's completely separated from the man. Something that separates and cuts off between the husband and the wife. But if you're leaving somebody out that she still remains prohibited to because of she was married to this guy, that would not be called a good get. So that was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's complaint against Rabbi Eliezer. Now, Rabbi Kiva also had a problem with Rabbi Eliezer. Let's say she according to Rabbi Eliezer, she married somebody else, not the brother of the person she's not supposed. She married somebody strange, and she had children with the guy, and then that person died or divorced. And she went ahead, and then she went ahead and married the guy that she wasn't supposed to marry. Turns out, by doing that, she invalidated the get she received in the first place. That causes the get to be null and void, the original get, and the kids will be mamzerim. So this teaches you that's not a good get. How could somebody be born kosher and because of the act of the parent later on in life causes them to be considered a mamzer? So it must be this is not a good get in the very beginning. Another reason Rabbi Akiva had another problem. Here he says like this. Let's say the person that she wasn't supposed to marry was a Kohen. Let's call him Pinchas the Kohen. He said, except I don't want you to marry Pinchas the Kohen. And then the guy that wrote the get died. So now, is she a divorced woman or a widow? Well, to Pinchas the Kohen, she was never really considered divorced. Only because she was never permitted to marry Pinchas the Kohen. She was never considered. So it wasn't. He was a condition in the get, or he was part of the get, that disallowed her from marrying Pinchas the Kohen. So almonas etzloi. So to him, she's really considered to be a widow. Ugrusha eitz koladim, but for the rest of the population, she was divorced because the get was a valid get to everybody else but Pinchas the Kohen. But nevertheless, Pinchas the Kohen cannot marry her because since she's called a mugureshes to the rest of the world, even though in relation to Pinchas, she is considered a widow, but to the rest of the world, she's considered a get, a grusha. So that's called a reach haget. It has the sound of a get, and she's called a mugureshes, and therefore Pinchas the Kohen can never marry this woman. So listen to where Rabbi Kiva goes here. So the Kal V'choima, Ma Grusha Shi Kal Asur B'Shvil Sada Gerish Boy, this person, the Pinchas the Kohen, is still usher to marry this woman because she's called a mugureshes. Eishes Ish Yichamur like Kol Shekain. The Eishes Ish, marrying a Gerush of our Kohen is only a lav. But an Eishes Ish, for somebody to marry an Eishes Ish is a big Avera. And so therefore, how is it that anybody is permitted to marry this woman? A woman gets a get that says, right? You're not allowed to marry so-and-so, but you're mutter to everybody. So in relation to Pliny, she's considered as if she didn't get a divorce. And so therefore, she is called somewhat an Ashes Ish. So we should not allow her to marry everybody else. That's how Rabbi Kiva said, Ein Zakrisis, this is not a good get. So we had 4 Tanoim who took Rabbi Eliezer to town. Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Loza ben Azariah, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and Rabbi Tarfon. Sounds like the Haggadah. Amaleh Rabbi Yeshua, so Rabbi Yeshua said, Ein Meshivin es ha'ari la'achamisa. You cannot start up with Rabbi Eliezer after he passed away, because if he was still around, he would still be able to defend himself. Because Rabbi Eliezer passed away, so let's not talk about it. So that ends the brisa. So Rava went ahead and said the whole brisa makes perfect sense, because had Rabbi Eliezer been around, he could have refuted all the questions against him, except one. Amar Rabba said, Kuli Isli Pircha. All the refutations against Rabbi Eliezer have a question. The Valmid Rabbi Loza ben Azariah, the Leslie Pircha. Rabbi Loza ben Azariah's refutation has no question. His was solid question. We'll see. Rabbi Loza ben Azariah said that the pasuk, seems to say that a severance package has to be totally allowing her to marry whoever she wants. Creases. We learned to the brisa. Rabbi Yossi agreed. I see that Rabbi Loza ben Azariah's refutation of Rabbi Eliezer is the best refutation from all around. Amamar. So the Gemara just discusses all the refutations against Rabbi Eliezer, and how can you refute those refutations? Amamar. Now Rabbi Tarfon had a problem with Rabbi Eliezer. The Amar, and he said, if she married Shimon, and she was usher to marry Reuven based on this marriage, and Shimon died, and now she falls to Reuven for Yibim. Reuven will not be allowed to do Yibim, so he caused by his condition or his statement in the get that she's not allowed to marry Reuven is causing something that could potentially not allow Reuven to perform the mitzvah of Yibim. So that was the Rabbi Tarfon's question. Oiker, so the Gemara says, is the person uprooting something from the Torah? Ihu akar. He really uprooted something for the Torah? I mean, he didn't say that she can't do Yibim. Ella, what we rather mean, masna la'aka dava min the Torah. He's making a condition that causes something to be uprooted from the Torah. Masna, he made a condition to uproot something from the Torah. Did he demand that she marry Shimon? She didn't have to marry Shimon. She could have married anybody in the world except Reuven. Ella says the problem is she is causing. He is causing to uproot something from the Torah. In case she goes ahead and marries Shimon, she won't be able to do. She won't be able to go fall to Yibam to Reuven. So Goyrim, is that your only problem, that he's causing Yibam not to be performed? There are many situations where the marriage happens and Yibam was not performed. In this scenario, Bas Achiv, a person who is the daughter of your brother. In other words, marrying your niece. You should never marry your niece, the daughter of your brother. Why? Shema Yamas Bleibam, maybe the person will die without children, and the daughter is now going to fall to Yibam to her father. And you're going to cause something to be uprooted in the Torah. That's the question of the refutation of Rab Tarfon. We have a question on Rab Tarfon's question against Rabbi Eliezer. Because then, just because you uproot Yibam, we have many scenarios where a person, marriage can uproot Yibam. Ubamai. Now, how did Rabbi Tarfon understand Rabbi Elazar's and Chachamim's argument? Did he understand it as that they're arguing on that what did the man say? Harayat muturas l'chol adam chutz, except so and so. That was the Gemara yesterday. What did he mean by Ella? Did he mean except so and so, except Ruvain, you're not allowed to marry? That's what he meant. If Rabbi Tarfon understood that when a man says that Rabbi Eliezer permitted get to be said, Harayat mutaris l'chol adam, except so and so, if that's the understanding of Rabbi Eliezer, the Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Moide Rabbi Eliezer b'magarish es ishtoi b'amala harayat mutaris l'chol adam chutz meploini. We learned in the Brisa, if a man says to his wife, Rabbi Eliezer would agree that if he divorces his wife and says you're permitted to marry everybody except so and so, and then she married somebody else, right? She didn't marry so and so. Then that guy died or that guy divorced her. So now she's in the game again. She can marry this person that she was usher, because the fact that she married somebody in between uprooted the previous guy's get, because now she had a second marriage, and now that second marriage takes over her marriage situation, and he divorced her or died. So now she's free for all. She can even go ahead and marry the Reuven, who she was previously usher from the first marriage. So therefore, how could Reb Tarfon come up with a pircha that says that if she married Shimon, Reuven would not be permitted to do Yibam with her? What are you talking about? According to this situation, if he said chutz, then once she married Shimon, all bets are off. When Shimon dies, she is permitted to marry Reuven. Ella ba'almanas. Rab Tarfon understood that Rabbi Eliezer only allowed this situation only if he said on condition. That means when he says chutz so and so, even Rabbi Eliezer says that's not a good get. It's only if he says harayat mutaris l'chol adam on condition you don't marry Reuven. So when you say the word condition, when you say the word on condition, so even if she married somebody else in between, that condition always remains until it's violated. Even if she married somebody else and that marriage ended, still the condition of the first marriage of not marrying Reuven still remains in effect, because it's not part of the statement of the get. Harayat mutaris l'chol except so and so. It's an outside condition which still stands even if she married somebody in between. And it's because of that Rab Tarfon asked his question: how could she marry Shimon if that's going to cause that she can't do Yibam to Reuven? Nana Rabbi Yossi Agalili. Rabbi Yossi Agalili had a problem with Rabbi. We're going to explain that. Where do we find anything in the Chumash that somebody's also to this one as permitted to that one? Everything is either usher to everybody, like chazer is usher to everybody, or kosher food is mutter to everybody. So the Gemara says, "V'loy, you don't see that concept in the Chumash. Truma kachim are usher to one and mutter to somebody else. It's mutter to a non-kohen. It's mutter to a kohen. It's usher to a non-kohen." Answers the Gemara, Isha Kamrina. Pertaining to marriage, that's what I never find something that's usher to one person and mutter to another person. So the Gemara says, "Arayis, the issues come here. Arayis, a person can't marry his sister. It's usher to him to marry his sister, but somebody else is permitted to marry his sister." The Gemara says, when somebody gets married, we don't find asur l'zeh mutar l'zeh. So the Gemara just leads up to it. Hareini eishes is. Every eishes is. When a person gets married, his wife becomes mutar to him and asur to everybody else. So what kind of question is Rabbi Yosef Glili's problem? How could a get allow her to marry everybody except one person? We find that an Ashes is mutter to one person and also to the rest of the world. Haidi Pircha, that was the refutation against Rabbi Yosef Glili's problem with Rabbi Eliezer. Ulumai, and how did Rabbi Yosef Glili understand Rabbi Eliezer? If he understood that the condition that what Rabbi Eliezer only permitted a get like this if it was said this way, on condition that you don't marry Reuven, on condition. If that was the case, if that's the way Rabbi Yosef Glili understood that, how could she say that she was usher to have any relations with Reuven? She's not totally usher to Reuven. She only cannot marry Reuven. That's the condition. Harei utla etzle, but she can have an adulterous relation, an affair with Reuven without marriage. So she's not totally usher to Reuven. So it's mutar lakoil. With this get. Ella, he understood that the get was bechutz. That means that he actually said that Rabbi Eliezer was talking about harayat mutaris l'chol adam chutz so and so, except so and so. I don't want to have marry that person. I don't want you to have any adult relationship with that Reuven. So that way, that was the get. You also lazeh or motel lazeh. And yet, that was Rabbi Yosef Glili's problem with Rabbi Eliezer, and we refuted Rabbi Yosef Glili's problem. Continues the Gemara. Nana Rabbi Kiva Amal. Rabbi Kiva had a problem. She married somebody from the street and had children. It's Amal and it's Karsha. If she went and became a widow or divorced, and then she goes ahead and marries Reuven, the one she wasn't supposed to marry. Get bottle. She's nullifying the original get. And the kids will be mamzer. So how could it be that somebody was born kosher, and because the act of their mother is causing that the kids should be mamzerim? So the Gemara says, the Gemara has a problem with Rabbi Kiva's problem. We should never allow her to, any condition. She should not be allowed to marry. She'll not keep the condition, and her kids will, the get will be nullified, and the kids will be mamzerim. Suppose there's a Tanai that she shouldn't go to a certain place. That's the condition of the get. Okay, she goes ahead, takes the get, and marries somebody, and then after having children, she goes to that certain place and nullify the get retroactively, and the kids become mamzer. So every get tonight should be like that. We don't validate tanoim conditions on a get. That's refutation against Rabbi Kiva's problem with Rabbi Eliezer. How did Rabbi Kiva understand Rabbi Eliezer? What was the extent of his argument? If Rabbi Kiva understood that Rabbi Eliezer was talking about when Harayat Mutaris l'kol Adam chutz so and so, except Reuven, well, then how could she be prohibited from marrying Reuven after she married somebody in between? The time we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer would agree. You're permitted to marry everybody except so and so. She married somebody in the interim, and then that marriage got dissolved because she got divorced, or the man died. She becomes mutter to the person that she was asar. And according to this understanding of Rabbi Eliezer, clearly she can never violate the neder, violate the condition of the get, and retroactively turn those children into mamzerim, because once she married somebody in between, that just makes the first marriage go away, and there's a new marriage over here, and once that marriage ended without conditions, she's permitted to marry that Reuven. Ella, it must be he understood that Rabbi Eliezer was talking about Baal Manas. Rabbi Eliezer understanding is when a person says chutz, Rabbi Kiva said Rabbi Eliezer would never say that's a permitted get. If he says chutz, it's not a permitted get. It's only if he says harayat mutaris l'kol adam, but on condition that you don't marry somebody, that's Reuven. You don't marry that. So when he says on condition, so then even if she in the interim marries somebody else, that would not invalidate that condition. So when that person subsequently passes on, she still remains also to marry Reuven. So in that case, you could retroactively make the children into mamzer. Davar another thing. Rabbi Kiva had two problems with Rabbi Elazar. He said this could be a problem. Reisha is that in the statute of Kohen. We gave the example if she was also for Pinchas, and then the guy died. So it turns out she was mugreshes to everybody else except to Pinchas. We look at her; she never was permitted to Pinchas, so she's looked at as an almana, and nevertheless she's not allowed to marry Pinchas because she has a reach haget. She's called a mugreshes. If she was called Muguresha, she cannot marry Pinchas the Kohen because she's called Mugureshes. So what the Gemara is saying is over here that the fact is that Rabbi Kiva's problem is that if she is called an Ashes Ish to one person, to that Reuven, even though she's permitted to everybody else, nobody should be allowed to marry her because she has the reyach of the noun of the sound of being an Ashes Ish, and Ashes Ish is a big gavera, so nobody should be allowed to marry this woman. Ubamai, how did Rabbi Kiva in this understanding? How did he understand Rabbi Elazar? If Rabbi Elazar was talking about almanas, that Rabbi Elazar was saying that Harayat Mutaris L'chol Adam, on condition you to marry Reuven. So that's what Rabbi Elazar says, that was the machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and Chachamim. Hai grusha etzle biznus. She is he only asked her from getting married, but to have an adulterous relationship, she is considered to be a divorce. So she's never osir on Pinchas. She's never osir on Pinchas because the fact is she could potentially have an affair with Pinchas. She just couldn't marry him. So she is considered Mugreshas to Pinchas. So you don't have that Kal V'chomer. So Ella B'chutz, he must have understood that the machlokes between Rabbi Elazar is and the Chachamim was if in the case when the person said Rem Tashkal Adam Chutz so and so. So now we have two versions of Rabbi Kiva held. Either he held that they're arguing on chutz, or he held that Rabbi Elazar and Chachamim are arguing if they say almanas. So the Gemara doesn't understand that. Rabbi Kiva, it's either or. Is chutz virle. If you held that the argument is chutz, then the question you should ask is chutz. That's question number 2. The almanas virle. If you hold that their argument is on almanas, then the only question you should ask is the almanas question number 1. So the Gemara says like this: Rabbi Kiva Shmiele, Rabbi Kiva heard he heard that people were talking about the machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and Chachamim, and some saying the argument is if they say chutz, and the argument some say the argument is about almanas. So that's what he covered all bases. Who, if the one who said chutz, that's my second question. The one who had a problem with, who interpreted the machlokes of Rabbi Elazar and Chachamim is almanas. So I have another pircha. My first question will remain the question. Umay pircha. What is the pircha on the second question? The davar achar. What was that? What did we have a problem with Rabbi Akiva's problem, Rabbi Elazar? Is a kahuna shani or Lesanamim is a kahuna kamaisele. So if the question was maybe we only machmir on you could say that we only say that Pinchas cannot marry this lady because she smells like a gerushin. That's only by Isakuna we're doing this chumrah, but we wouldn't say this chumrah. Make it public that and nobody can marry her because she's a tzad Ashes is to Reuven. That we wouldn't say. Maybe because it's a kahuna, because regarding kahuna we go strict. So the Gemara says, but Rabbi Elazar only knows his source, that it's permitted to have such a marriage, to be permitted to have such a get. His source is from a kohen. Isha grusha misha la yikachu, where the Torah says that if a man gives a woman a get and says you can't marry anybody, but here's your get, that's enough of a reach haget that she can't marry a kohen. So that's the source of Rabbi Elazar, that you could give a get that allows her to marry everybody but one person. So that could not be a refutation against Rabbi Akiva's problem with Rabbi Elazar. And says the Gemara, Rava k'Rabbi Yana mishum zakin echad komasnele. Rava learned that the source, Rabbi Elazar says, how does that work? He had it because of the other source that we had. What was the other source in the previous Amid? The source was that the Torah says that even if the get only allowed her to marry one other person, that's still a good get. So therefore, there's no differentiation between kahuna and Eishesish. So if we find that we're machmir, that was the problem. That we have against Rabbi Akiva. That if we find that was the problem that we had against Rabbi Akiva. That because of that, we can say that maybe we're only a machmir because by Isakuna, if there's a reach aget, we don't allow her to marry. We don't allow her to get married to the Pinchas the Kohen. But if there's a reach eishes, that doesn't necessarily asa her from marrying anybody else. Anyway, so ends all these problems against Rabbi Eliezer. Amal and Rabbi Yeshua came to defend Rabbi Eliezer. He said to the other Tanoim, Ein Meshivin Esari Lachamisa. We cannot answer and slug up the lion after he died. Rabbi Eliezer passed away. If Rabbi Eliezer was around, he would defend himself. So let's not talk about him. The man Rabbi Yeshua Kavasisvi, does Rabbi Yeshua agree with Rabbi Eliezer? If he's defending Rabbi Eliezer, it must be he agrees with him. He also had a problem with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And the Gemara is going to explain where you see Rabbi Yeshua had a problem with Rabbi Eliezer opinion. This is what Rabbi Yeshua said. I also have a problem. But I mean to say, between me and you, even if we all have problems against Rabbi Eliezer, we don't try to refute the lion after he passed away. Since Rabbi Eliezer is not here to defend him, let's not publicly say our problems with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. So the Gemara just finishes off the whole sugya. My pirchad Rabbi Yeshua. What was Rabbi Yeshua's problem with Rabbi Eliezer? Tanya, we learned in the Brayso. Rabbi Yeshua, makish koidmi abayis shniya lekoidmi rishona. The Chumash says that if a woman got divorced and married somebody else, and it makes a juxtaposition between the way she got married to the first husband to the way she got married to the second husband. Before she got married to her first husband, who eventually gave her a divorce, she was just a regular seminary girl, or a girl that had no ties to anybody else. So also when she marries the second person, she has to be completely severed from the from the first guy. She has no ties to the first guy, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer opinion that you can give a get that still connects her to the first marriage because she's still also to one person because of the first marriage. That's not a good get according to Rabbi Yeshua. Gufo, we learned in it before. Rabbi Eliezer agreed. And he said to her, you're mutter to marry everybody except so and so. So this was the question that if she interim got married to somebody else, Rabbi Eliezer would agree that she's now if that marriage ended, she could go ahead and marry to the first person that she was usher. In our case, if the man said the first marriage said Harayat Materos L'Chol Adam except Reuven, and then she got married in between, and then that marriage got dissolved, she could go ahead and get married to Reuven. Hey, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar had a problem with Rabbi Elazar. Hey, that the first guy made her usher, and now the second marriage now matters her to Reuven. How could somebody undo somebody's prohibition that somebody made? Let's examine that. We find that in Chumash. A Yavama, the Baal Oisa, the first husband asked her, the Yavam matter, and the Yavan undid that. The Yavan now, gives her a chalitza or marries her. So the Gemara says, no, Hasam hu Yavam hu the Yavan is the one that causes the Isser. What's the whole purpose? Why she can't get married to anybody else if a woman falls to Yibam is because she's tied to a Yavam. The Baal, because if the Baal causes the Isser of a Yavam, why can't the Yavama get married to anybody? Because of the husband? The husband's dead. The original husband's dead. She's permitted to marry because of the first husband, because he's not here anymore. It's only because she's connected to a Yavam, that's why she can't marry anybody else, and he's the one that could be matter her to marry either by giving a chalitza. So the Gemara says like this: Harei Nidarim, but we find a person who makes a vow. The noida, so the person who makes the vow makes it a prohibition. The chachamatim, and the chacham says that she's permitted. So we see that somebody can make an isser and somebody can be matter. Rabbi Yechon says, "Ein chachamata klum ala b'charata." The chacham doesn't matter something, he makes a regret. In other words, the person comes to the Chacham and says, had I known such and such, I never would have made the neder in the first place. So the whole neder was a mistake. So it's the person untying himself. And the Chacham is just guiding him how to undo that. The Gemara says, so let's take a case where a husband can nullify his wife's vows. So we see that a woman makes the neder and the husband can nullify it. So it's two different people. And says the Gemara, this is what Rav Pinchas Shvei the Rava, Rav Pinchas Shvei the Rava, called Hay Nederes, and Das Mala He Nederes. Whoever makes a neder, it's only the condition that her husband would agree to the neder. So it's really her undoing the neder. It's not the husband undoing it. She's making a neder on condition that her husband agrees to the neder. That's how it works in the Chumash. Basically, so you had a problem with Rabbi Elazar's opinion. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar had a problem with Rabbi Elazar's opinion. How is it possible that she's also to Reuven because of the first marriage, and then if she subsequently gets married to somebody else and that marriage gets dissolved, she's now permitted to Reuven? One person made it Reuven also, and now somebody else can make Reuven mutar. We never find somebody making aser and somebody making it mutar. It's usually the same person. So that was Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's problem with Rabbi Eliezer. Nema Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had a problem. Krisis dovar akaris beinoy levena. Halamadu toshein ze krisis. The Chumash says a good get is something that is totally dissolved, and therefore, if you totally dissolve, then it can't be a good get. If you're not totally dissolved, if you're still also to somebody because of the first marriage, that's not a good get. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's problem with Rabbi Elazar's opinion. The Rabbanan, high krisis my avdilay. Look, every rabbi who had a problem with Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had a very clear-cut reason that it's not a good get. The Chumash says krisus, and something that severs. It has to be a total severance. High krisis my avdilay. What did they do with the word krisis? And says the Gemara, they needed like the time, like according to the Brisa. He gave her a condition on a get that you're never going to drink wine again, or a condition you're never going back to your father's house forever. That's not a good severance. If he puts a timeline in it, that's a good krisis. So krisis teaches you cannot make a condition that lasts forever. That's what krisis teaches you. But it doesn't necessarily teach you, according to the other Rabbanan, that has to be such a severance that she cannot marry somebody else, because that person eventually dies, so it's not a forever thing. So therefore, and she's permitted to marry everybody else. So therefore, they had other problems with Elazar's opinion. The idach, and according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he says, "Mikaris krisis nafka." I can learn both things. I can learn that it has to be shloshim yom. It can't be forever. And I could also learn that it has to be total severance. You can't leave somebody who she's still usher to. The idach, but the other rabbanan kares krisis le darshan. They only learn one drasha from kares. They don't darshan the extra krisus, because the Torah could have written kares and wrote krisus. They say that's not something you can darshan to learn to limuda. Okay. Gemara continues and says, Amar Rava said, person says, here's your get, on the condition that you don't drink wine my entire life. Ain't that krisis? That's not a krisis. That's not a good get. You're not allowed to drink wine as long as so-and-so is alive. Krisis, then it's a good get, because that if so-and-so is eventually going to die. So it's not a condition that lasts forever. So the Gemara says, why by if he made a contingent on the life of so and so, the dilma mois mekaimela tonight. She could that maybe he will die, and he will be able to, and she will be able to keep the condition. So his own life, dilma mois, maybe he'll die. Mekaimela tonight, and the tonight is ending. In other words, the condition is over because he died. Ella, so you have to change Rava's situation. If he says my entire life, all the days of his life, my life, or so and so's life, krisis, that is considered a good krisis. That is considered a good krisis. The Gemara asks one final question. Rava asks from Rav Nachman. If a man says, I'm giving you a get for one day. Today you're not my wife. Tomorrow you're back my wife. Now, what's the din with such a statement of a get? I'll ask you according to Rabbi Lezer, according to Rabbanim. I'll ask you this question according to Rabbi Lezer. Ad kan loy ka'ama Rabbi Lezer hasam. Rabbi Lezer only said it's a good get if a person says Harayat mutaris l'chol adam chutz miruve, right? That's a good get. Over there, el dman kashari l'olam. Whoever he permitted, that you permitted to marry everybody, it's a forever. So therefore, whoever you permitted, so that part of the get makes sense. You're permitting someone to marry her to marry forever. Over here, he's only saying that it's a get for one day. So even Rabbi Lezer would say it's not a good get. Maybe it's no difference. There is no difference since he's actually saying that for one day she's permitted. So that's considered a good get. I'll ask you a question according to Rabbanan. Over there, it's not a good get according to Rabbanan, because she's still not totally severed from him. Because basically she's still usher on one person. Over here, he said for one day you're permitted to marry anybody in the world. So Kivin the Pascha, so since she was separated or severed from him one day, Pascha, she'll be severed forever. So it is a good get. After he asked this question and he answered it. Rav answered this question. He answered it himself. That is, we go to the top of Pei Daled Rev Mistabra. It makes perfect sense to say that what? That Bein Reb Lezer, Bein Rabbana cave in the Pascha. As soon as the psaka, as soon as the get was valid for one day, even though he said tomorrow you're not my wife. Tomorrow you're back to be my wife. We ignore that part because once she was already severed from him, that's too late. The Rashi says on the last daf on the Pei Gimel Amud Beis, Pascha l'chol adam la'olam, she la'olam shuv eine ishtoi ad sheyachzeren v'yekadeshena. Therefore, since she's permitted to marry anybody, so it's not his wife unless he remakes kedushin with her. So therefore, this Tanai is invalid, and the get would be a good get. So ends this long daf Pei Gimel.